All right. So it's Jeremy, Seamus. We're here with,
Shayna Dabbs.
and we're gonna be doing our first podcast on professional and college athletes' injuries and the long-lasting effects on their career and their ability to do things and function as a human after sports. So you are the head of sports management here at
I
Elon.
am. Yes, I'm an associate professor in the Department Chair of Sport Management, and I've been here for 10 years.
Wow. Okay.
And I also, I guess, should add that I was a college softball athlete at NC State. I was a pitcher.
So you from North Carolina?
I am, yes.
Okay.
Charlotte area, Huntersville, Lake Norman, but yes.
So what drew you to this? What was your major in college?
Yes, and my major at NC State was Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management with a focus in sport. And then I have a master's in sport administration and a PhD in sport management. So
Okay.
all sport.
Awesome.
All sport, yeah.
What made you want to be a professor?
Well, I was a college coach to start out my career, and as I was navigating changing career paths, I felt like coaching and teaching
Yeah.
were very similar. Being able to mentor students and talk about sport and prepare you for the industry, and so teaching to me was the next step. And after I graduated, I came straight to Elon, and I've been here ever since. Yeah, and we're happy you're here now.
Okay. So we're kind of going into the injuries part of sports with college athletes and professional athletes, and kind of the instability of not necessarily their career, because understand not everyone goes pro and not everyone is making these huge contracts, but it's even college athletes, even high school athletes who are just especially the repeated injuries and hits to the head, and kind of just talk about how it's kind of underlooked. Do you have an example? Do you know when you saw the first time you saw an athlete suffer a serious injury?
Yeah, so I think, when you're comparing contact sports like a football, a soccer, even lacrosse or something where there's a lot of fast action happening, you do run the risk of more like head and neck injuries. But I think across the board you see more like ACL tears, Achilles tears across sports and across gendered sports. And obviously you don't want athletes to get injured. I was blessed to not have a serious injury when I played. I did have some broken ribs from overuse of playing, not like I got in a car wreck or anything. But I've seen multiple injuries in terms of ACL tears, and I did have a concussion once. There was a sort of a play at the plate where as a pitcher I was running to cover home base, and I one of the players that was running collided with me. I was fine, but if happens over and over and over again. But I think more times than not, I've just seen people have to exit playing, like their playing careers are over because they've had quite a few concussions back to back to back, too close together.
Have you seen many of those?
I mean, I've seen a handful of examples where, some athletes are just more prone to concussions. And that could even just be like what happens if you are an athlete, you get concussions, but then what happens if you like trip or something out and about and you get a concussion again. So so I think that's the thing maybe some people don't realize is when you get your first concussion, like the recovery period is really where you don't want to get that next concussion. That's where things can get really really more traumatic. Yeah, really more traumatic.
And that's another thing. Yet the studies estimated that 50% of concussions go undiagnosed. A lot of football players. I mean, and I remember a couple of times I played in high school, played hockey, getting hit in the head and kind of just get up and keep going.
Yeah,
It's
keep going.
so much amplified in like football and like the higher levels and contact sports. And
Do you think like one of the main injuries in sports, like getting concussions, is that the one that leads to most long-term effects, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I know you've heard of CTE, but there's just no way to determine what those impacts are going to be long term, but we have some real life examples of former athletes who have passed away that have extreme, I would say, their brains really look like scrambled eggs compared to
Mhm.
what they should look like.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the biggest examples is probably Aaron Hernandez. And
Yeah.
let's take away the character
Mhm.
issues and things like that. When he killed himself in jail as a very young individual, they studied his brain for CTE, and he had like a level 4 as a very young individual, which can really impact like emotional regulation and thoughts and hallucinations and just a bunch of things that really is like outside of my expertise, but we know
Mhm.
that those things are real.
Yeah.
It happened to be where this individual was super young, died, had a brain to study, and the brain study showed that obviously he had major head injuries over the course of his time playing football.
And that's what's so bad, that especially things like CT and other like head injuries aren't really diagnosable until after death or
Right.
a full brain scan. You have examples like Antonio Brown or Le'Veon Bell, are just like who were phenomenal football players, had great careers, and their names are now kind of tarnished because
Of their actions.
because they lack decision making. But if you all these repeated hits to the head, especially those players like
Mhm.
took terrible hits to the head, and after those moments they were kind of different.
Right.
And so people kind of, I feel like, don't even understand what is going on in some of these people's heads. These
Mhm.
athletes leads to a lot of depression,
Mhm.
continued concussions, depression and suicide as well.
And to be honest, they may not know they may not
Mhm.
be able to understand it either. And I think as a society, it's easy to see these athletes and say, well, that's a bad person, right? Or they're
Yeah.
crazy. But we, from a normal lens, we're not medical individuals who know exactly what they're dealing with internally.
Mhm.
So I think that's a challenge. Just
When you were like a coach, did you see more like of your players like who have gotten injured, like want to play again, or like you had like kind of like given because of their
yeah. Well, I coach at a high level, so I coached
Okay.
at Georgia Tech, which is
Yeah.
a Division I school, and
what sport? Was
softball.
it?
And typically, when you're competing at that high of a level, like you really have a drive to want to be super
Yeah,
successful. So I've really only seen athletes who want to come back from
Yeah, that's good.
injury and challenges. But one thing I think is important to note is when you're a college athlete or a high school athlete, or maybe you're playing intramurals or something like that, like typically when you're an athlete, that's a huge piece of your identity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to all of a sudden separate. And I think that's where research that studies in athletes who are injured and the impact that makes on their well-being because they are removed from their sport,
Mhm.
because they're removed from the team, they have to stay back, they can't travel,
Yeah.
they're sort of by themselves now. I think the injury itself is bad enough, but then what happens when you take that identity away because you have 6 months till you can play again?
Yes. Exactly.
So it's paying attention to those things as well, like what support do those athletes have who are, doing rehab, 3 times a day, but they can't get out on the field and that's all they want to do.
Yeah, not only is it a physical
Yeah.
struggle, but then a mental
Right.
struggle
Exactly.
as well. Yet, do you think most athletes consider the long-term toll that the sport is taking on their body?
Yes and no. I think nowadays we have a lot more, I would say, ways to help recover from injuries, maybe faster ways,
Yes.
maybe more advanced ways. Even when you think about sport medicine, strength and conditioning, nutrition, sports psychology, all of these things that can help the holistic person. But playing 4 years in college and then pro perhaps, or playing in high school, going to college and then going to pro, you're playing, you'd be playing like, 16 years of your life.
Mhm.
So that's at some point it's going to take a
Big
toll on
toll.
your
Yeah,
body.
yeah, exactly.
I think it just depends on the seriousness of the injuries or the risk involved. So we know there's risk involved in soccer. We know there's risk involved in football, like in all sports. But you love the sport enough to want to accept those risks because you want to compete.
No, yeah,
So,
yeah.
but I think sports like football or rugby or those really hard contact sports, I think those are when you have to sit back and say, okay, how does my body feel? Are my knees are my knees going to give out on me? Am I going to be able to play with my kids when I'm 50 years old? Those things you think about, but I think you think about those more when you're at a professional level, maybe not so much at the college level where you're still sort of younger, vibrant. You have your muscles are a little bit more flexible.
Maybe thinking more in the short term.
Yeah, and you're like accomplishing your dream to play college ball. So I don't know if you're thinking about, well, in 20 years, how's my back gonna feel? You know?
Yeah.
Alright, what are some ways you've seen injuries affect athletes after college? So maybe some of your players or any example of either someone needs to struggle getting a job after from career work or family work.
Yeah, so, obviously teaching in sport management, we have quite a few athletes that come through here to then go navigate, their own jobs and stuff.
Do a lot of athletes here take this course?
We have quite a few athletes that come through our major. I would say, I don't know that injury perhaps relates to the impact after college. Maybe it does. Maybe they struggle with, some pain here or there. But I would say more like college athletics prepares them to be successful because of all that they've learned while trying to juggle 4 years of college while competing. So more things like they actually have like tangible examples of when they've pushed through struggle. They've had tangible examples of having to work towards a common goal with the team. They have time management ability because they're juggling everything. They understand what commitment looks like to be able to continue to get up early and do things and push through things when they're hard. I think the one thing is like if someone is injured during their 4 years in college, what did that teach them about themselves? So it's more like reflecting on what the injury taught them about themselves as opposed to the injury defining them when they leave.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Definitely possible.
So for example, hopefully if you're injured and you come back from it, you're learning that you're resilient, right? And that you're really motivated to get back, and maybe you don't take your sport for granted like you did before. So I think it's a more positive on just being a college athlete. The injury itself, I think, just comes from like how well have you healed from it and will it impact you down the road. I got in a car wreck in August and I shattered my wrist, and you can see my scar here. I had surgery, so I have a plate and screws in here, and this is my pitching wrist, but I don't even remember that I have surgery. So like, for example, this could have, I would say I'm still an athlete, right? But if I was a college athlete and this happened,
That would be.
I was bringing my rehab stuff to the Oak House to like do it at the Oak House, but I was motivated to heal, to get back. And so I think you would see that from athlete or like no athlete. Like I feel like you're not a college athlete, right?
No.
But if you hurt your wrist, you probably would want to do things to be back to normal.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's common for us, most of us all.
So, have you known athletes who have felt lost after an injury in their career?
Yes.
It's hard to go from that your whole life, kind of, that's all you're doing. Now all of a sudden you have to just start
over.
Start completely over.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a difference in being injured and being taken away from the sport and being injured and it ending your career. I had a student here who had to walk away from the sport because her hip was never healing. And her sport involved a lot of running, so we can imagine. So she had to think about, like, how am I going to be able to walk in the next couple of years if I keep this up? So she just had hip surgery, and she's feeling so much better. And while she might miss the sport, she's feeling better. She's like no longer waking up constantly in pain. So, and also I think athletes are realizing there's different ways to get involved. So maybe you can be a student coach, a student manager. Maybe you can do sort of the statistics and analytics around whatever sport you're playing. So what other ways can you get involved if your injury takes you out of the sport? But I think more times than not, it's the injury and the process of healing from it and your intention to go back to the sport that makes it the most challenging because of that time you have to be away from quote unquote who you are, what you know.
Yeah.
And then uncertainty of will I ever be the same again?
Yeah.
Okay. So, if you were to change something about how you prepare athletes for long term, if it was throughout the school or in professional sports, or something more gear, whatever, if there's something you would change, what would you change?
So my sister and I, we own a nonprofit here in Burlington that trains and coaches young softball players. My sister and I happen to coach the elite team that all of those girls on that team want to play college ball. So I would say being in the youth sports space.
Yeah.
And this could be across all sports. Flag football all the way to AAU basketball, it doesn't matter. I think that there needs to be more education for coaches around the proper fundamentals of play, whether that's how you throw, how you run, how you tackle, all those things. And then I also think there needs to be some limitations on like how much athletes are playing, right? So like these young folks, before they ever get to high school, they're playing so many games.
Pitchers getting their arm thrown.
They're constantly on the road. They're constantly training, year round, and it's like, where's the balance of
where's the rest?
actually protecting our bodies? And then by the time you get to college,
It's all
you could be worn down, right? So I think there needs to be some more understanding of in my opinion, the detriment of specializing in sport too early. So for example, you're better off to play 3 sports than you are to play baseball your whole life, right? Work different muscles, learn different, fundamentals, all those things. And then it gets to the point where you do need to specialize, right? But not early on. But I think more education and training for coaches, and then I think more just regulation or really focus on how much is too much for those in high school and earlier.
All right. So our final thought. Thank you so much for doing this. Really
you're
appreciate
welcome.
it. If you were talking to a young athlete and their family, what is one piece of advice you'd give them to think beyond the game?
Let's see. One piece of advice I would give them is, I would say, although being an athlete makes up a huge piece of who you are, it's not all of who you are. And so I think it's okay to dedicate time and energy into your sport, but it's also important to have other hobbies and friends outside of your sport, focus on your academics. And trust me, this is from a very competitive high athlete myself, but I also made sure to focus on my academics and knowing that most of us are not going to go pro. I actually was blessed to play a season of professional softball.
Really?
And my sister played softball internationally for 6 months.
That's awesome.
In Italy. So we were blessed, right? But like softball, you can't make enough money to not have another job. It's not like basketball or baseball or anything. But we were blessed to be able to do that. But also I always knew I was working towards something else. So while I wanted to be highly competitive at college, I also wanted to be highly competitive in the job market. And so I think just making sure it's not all of who you are, and that can help if you do get an injury, that can help you turn your attention to some other things that are outside of the sport until you can get healed.
All right.
You always have like an open mind.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well,
Cool.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Thanks.
That was our first episode of our podcast.